Wonderful. Warm welcome, everyone. I'm incredibly pleased to see you, especially as our Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission is housing at the other end of the university. I was literally scared 2 days ago when I got the note that they're going to have an event here at the same time, and I was thinking to myself, well, I booked a nice lecture theater, who is the Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission to overrule that. But thankfully, our communications department looked them into the eyes and said, this event is much more important. We're going to have to put the Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission in a sad lecture room in the other end. And it makes a lot of sense, because this is not only a fun, but also interesting and important topic that we are going to be discussing here today. As you see here, we've been working on a project on Russian command and control from various perspectives that we today have been working through all day in a workshop. We have 3 colleagues that are unable to join us here today: Andrew Monaghan, Christine Van Brusgaard, and Dara Massicott. Sorry, thank you. And what we're going to showcase here to you today is kind of a bit of the highlights on how we approach this subject of Russian command and control from different aspects, and then we will open up for an open discussion with you here. First of all, a big thanks for our dean, who's kindly supporting this project that made it all happen, flying in these people. But since I'll be speaking a lot more later, I will not speak anymore now. I will just introduce the moderator of today's session, Dr. Michael Ruland, Senior Advisor with US European Command Russia Strategic Initiative. Yeah, we can stay seated unless you really want.
Speakers, okay. So I will provide just a brief. It's not terribly necessary at this point because Oscar's already introduced the project, but I'll reflect on the order of our speakers. Our first speaker will be to my left, Mike Kofman, then Oscar Janssen, then Katarzyna Zysk, and Dima Adamski. If you don't know them already, this is obviously should be an incredible treat. I mean, when we thought about developing a project on Russian command and control, we essentially went to the community and identified, again, with Oscar and Dima sort of being there at the origin, who are the best people in the field that we want to be part of this project. And so what you see here in front of you today, and obviously as part of the project overall, are 4 of the best experts in the world on these issues. And so what we're really interested to do is to probe and understand, again, a much more complex view of Russian command and control, lessons that we're obviously learning from the current war, but also longer understanding, a longer perspective on Russian command and control to kind of get out of perhaps the oversimplification that we sometimes fall into, and provide deeper understanding as a contribution to the field. So with that brief introduction, we'll hand it over to Mike to take us to current lessons.
Yeah, sure. So I think this project that we're currently working on, at least, is covering a couple of areas looking at command and control, Russian military organization performance. I focus more on the kind of strategic operational military level. And the 3 sections that I will cover very briefly, and by briefly I mean literally barely a few minutes, this is going to be like the very, very wave tops of it, are kind of assumptions about performance, what happened, adaptation on the Russian side, and a bit of where we are now in terms of Russian military in Ukraine. So the first part I'll say openly is that there are principally sort of 2 real wars in this war. There's the first 30 days and everything that happened afterwards, right? Initial 30 days are very important because whatever your assumptions might have been about Russian military performance, right, it's very clear that the initial 30 days of the war, the Russian military acted and looked very differently than I think most of us expected, very much including myself. We'll talk about some of the reasons for that. But one of the biggest reasons, I think, early on, there was a misinterpretation that most of Russian military performance was just due to a failure to perform, failure to execute. But it's clear now, we now know a great deal about the opening days of the war, that the Russian military operation was meant to be complementary to an intelligence operation that the political leadership assumed had shaped and set the conditions for a coup de main, an attempt to decapitate both Ukrainian leadership and rapidly take over the country. And the Russian military was deployed in peacetime strength with a strategy that from a pure sort of military rationale made very little sense. That is, by itself, it doesn't really scan. And what happened in practice is that Russian forces, under very stylized rules of engagement, rapidly advanced to go down roads, blockade cities, blockade Ukrainian units. And in many respects, the operation didn't reflect the way the Russian military trained and organized the fight, both because of the political assumptions and how the force was assembled for it. But added to that, because this particular project that we're most recently working on looks at command and control, the Russian military wasn't organized from a command and control perspective in the way it either typically organizes for large-scale combat operations or in the way it organized itself previously during the original invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. So it looked very different as essentially 5 independent groupings of forces with the Russian Air Force split to support them without major strategic operation conducted by the Russian Air Force. And a whole host of things basically looked very, very different for, I think, the reason that the Russian military not only didn't execute, but did not even attempt to execute some of the things we anticipated. Critical infrastructure strikes and things of that nature. Okay, so compounded to that, there's the issue of every military is likely going to perform differently than it expects, but one of the biggest challenges the Russian armed forces had was scaling. The biggest separator in modern militaries is the ability to scale combat operations. Most militaries cannot take what they can do with a battalion or a few battalions and turn that into actual performance of the force on a scale of 100, 150,000 troops, all right? And the Russian military broke in many respects in trying to scale combat operations. And it revealed a fair amount of rot in the force in terms of weakness in the fundamentals, training, overall force quality, maintenance, sustainment. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part was that the Russian military's core problems were more in the software of the military itself. Lack of organizational capacity, lack of experience, and a real problem in trying to translate theory, operational concepts that are developed, into practice. This is actually a historical challenge for the Russian armed forces. As a military, the Russian military is deeply theoretical, but has always struggled with actual execution and getting the fundamentals right, which requires raising the force quality, doing the training, actual integration of systems. Although to be fair, after 2 years, they've shown some significant adaptation and development in these areas, where initially the military fell very flat at the beginning. All right. Lastly, it also merits saying that the Ukrainian armed forces perform much better than expected, okay? In many cases, organically and due to their own initiative, and also due to the volunteer efforts of Ukrainian citizenry. And from the very beginning of the war, and some of this is known, and I think over time some of this will be better known, let's be frank, Western intelligence played a significant role in shaping battlefield outcomes. And while Ukrainian will to fight was very critical from the outset of the war, Western intelligence and material support became a very significant factor later on in 2022, and has been so ever since. It's fundamentally the combination of those two. But it's very difficult to evaluate any battlefield outcomes or performance without looking at the key external factors that were involved. On adaptation, so post-mobilization, the Russian military addressed structural manpower deficits in the force, began to conduct a significant force expansion, and started to experiment with a lot of evolution in terms of assault detachments and utilization of expendable forces. It also began to really reorganize logistics, fires. I obviously don't have time to get into all of this, but just to give you a bit of a taste for it, and particularly proved itself adaptable in the rapid adoption of new types of drone systems, commercial systems, and the proliferation of new types of electronic warfare systems as well. Right? So on the tech side, after 2 years, you've seen significant evolution. But all that being said, the Russian military demonstrates a fundamental problem still in combat operations today, which is that despite the fact that the Russian military has a manpower advantage of hundreds of thousands of troops at the front and has fixed the manpower pipeline for the force, despite the fact that it has a material advantage in fires and artillery ammunition, and it has to an extent an equipment advantage as well, at least for the duration of this year, it has largely been relegated to the conduct of small-scale attacks, no larger than platoon or company level, and incremental gains that by themselves cannot add up to a major breakthrough, right? So the force is there, the material is there, but the force employment capacity is very small. In fact, the Russian military and the Ukrainian military have both been struggling for the last 2 years with the inability to employ forces at scale in offensive operations, right? And we can discuss why, right? But the three principal explanations, and this is likely the intersection of these three factors, is first the difficulty of overcoming conditions. Both sides have struggled with overcoming a prepared defense and have not been able to establish the relevant enablers to breach a prepared defense or the requisite fire superiority or other advantages that they need to overcome it. So they have, in some respects, chosen to operate at smaller scale in order to reduce their losses. The second one is force quality. Restoring force quantity was not Russia's principal problem, but restoring force quality is. And Russia lost the better part of the force in the first 30 days of the war, along with the most experienced leadership and many of the trained personnel, and has struggled to recover ever since. Replacing quantity is not the same thing as replacing quality. And when the quality of the force isn't there, it's very hard to execute complex operations at scale, and it's very hard to do things doctrinally, right? And of course, the third one, and that's the one that we're going to explore in this work, and so I don't have the answer, but I'll tee it up, is command and control at the end of the day, right? Command and control organization. When you look at the first part of the war, the Russian military is really missing the pieces, okay? First, it's not organized and it doesn't conduct the initial invasion the way it trains and organized to fight. Then it loses the better part of the force, and so the pieces are no longer there, and the commanders can't possibly work with it because the people, the material is gone. The force is variegated, incohesive, and there's a structural deficit of manpower through 2022, okay? But today you can see that in terms of all these basic categories, the things are there, but the force is still unable to conduct large-scale combat operations, particularly on the offense, and that suggests that there are still significant issues in command and control, right? Okay, I hope that this is a good opener. I don't know if I stuck to 10 minutes. I probably ran over a little bit.
1 minute to back to the group.
So I would say jet-lagged people from the United States should be given an extra allowance because time is slower for you when you jet-lagged, as you know. Like
Gave a minute to Katarzyna,
Okay.
so you're good. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Got an extra minute.
And I will just pick up some notes here. That's why I will do it standing. No, I want to pick up a little bit where Mike left this, because there's been 2 wars, and many times it seems like we're still debating the first 30 days in terms of our stereotyped version of how we're understanding the wars and all the problems that were there. For my chapter, I want to address something which kind of answers a bit, why did the war start the way it started? But it also answers another question, which is one I often get. What did you wish you knew when the war started? And this article, in essence, actually answers that. Even though everything was hiding in plain sight before me, I hadn't done the deep dive into it before this war started. So my research is looking at what role does the general staff have as a political actor? How do it influence the most important decisions of the Russian Federation, the decision to go to war? And how has that role developed over time? So I'm going back all the way to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which is, I think, illustrating for a number of purposes. We have a situation where there's pro-war sentiment driven in the Politburo by a troika from the defense minister, the foreign minister, and most importantly, the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. It kind of goes all the way down to the preparations to the war. The Politburo calls up the chief of general staff, Nikolai Ugarkov, a clever man. They ask him, hey, we're going to invade Afghanistan. What do you think about it? And he says, this is a really bad idea. If we're going to do it, we would need something like 300 to 600,000 men. They tell him, shut up, you're an officer, you should follow orders. We're the politicians, we're setting everything. Later the same day, 12th of December, they call together the whole Politburo and they say, we're going to invade Afghanistan, what do you think? And he says, nah, this will not work. And then they say, you get 75,000 troops, but don't worry. We'll have a political coup d'etat. We'll take out Amin, who assassinated his predecessor Taraki. You send in KGB Alpha. And it was relying on 3 big assumptions. One was, first of all, a coup d'etat will fix everything. We will take control by a coup d'etat. Secondly, if there's fighting, the Afghan National Army will do the fighting, so we don't need to do that much fighting. But thirdly, if there is fighting, It will be enough to seize the cities, and then the countryside will come around sooner or later. All of these three assumptions proved incredibly false, and it also illustrates two things about the general staff. First of all, that they stood up to politics and said, this is our best military advice, and this is a really bad idea. And the general staff kept recommending withdrawal for the first years throughout the war. In the situation, Brezhnev had very bad health, and he was not really present in the Politburo, which managed KGB head Andropov to kind of dominate decision-making. Another instance, I want to go to the first Chechen war, very much driven by Defense Minister Pasha Grashev, who yet to this day kind of epitomizes favorable assumption in the Russian military system. The most famous quote is that he will be able to take Grozny with one airborne assault regiment in 2 hours. That wasn't really the plan, actually. They drew up a plan that 30,000 men would drive into Grozny in administrative columns in 3 lines of attacks, and everything would go fine. They were planning on taking Grozny within 5 days. What does the general staff say? They say, this is really bad. Colonel General Vorobyev, who was put in charge of the operation, he objected. He was forced to resign. The commander of the VDV, the airborne assault troops, and 3 deputy defense ministers were intentionally sidelined by the defense minister because they were afraid of their objections. When the decision was taken, you had a combination of 540 resignations and 557 people fired in the general staff. And the interesting part about this, yet again, you do have opposition from the military expertise telling the political leadership saying, this is a really bad idea. Needless to say, the First Chechen War proceeded with favorable assumptions, which is not unique for Russia for any sense, even though it's omnipresent. And it took 3 months, basically, until you can get any control of Grozny. And 2 years later, there's a de facto ceasefire agreement. There's a ceasefire agreement where Chechnya is de facto independent. But some things happens. The Second Chechen War, 1999. The war that rode Putin to presidency, going from basically unknown to becoming the president in Russia. The novelty for this war was you didn't have the same amount of favorable assumptions, thinking that everything will just go well, we will waltz in there, for natural reasons. You fought the Chechens just 3 years earlier. You had a pretty decent idea what the fight was going to be. So, the Russian armed forces committed 100,000 men. There were no blitzkrieg. There were no kind of coup d'etat. This was a methodic encirclement of all of Chechnya, together with massive artillery and aerial bombardments, basically bombing everything to pieces. But you did have something actually interesting from the terms of the political military dynamic. You do have the key generals, Shamanov, commander of the 58th Army, and Troshev, commander of the military district south, challenging Putin publicly, saying, leave a hands-off approach to this war, we will settle it. And Putin accepted it, even though later he got them back and kind of sent them off to become governors in faraway regions and kind of outmaneuver them in the end. Going a bit quicker, Georgian War 2008, it was a war in which I would argue that the Russian leadership were kind of hell-bent on going to war, but they were completely confused by the timings. It was not a great timing for the Russian side. President Medvedev was departing for Volga. Putin and Nikolai Patrushev was in Beijing. No one could get a hold of Defense Minister Serdyukov for the first 10 hours of the war. Chief of General Staff Makarov delegated all command to the commander of the military district to run the war. Just 2 months earlier, Chief of General Staff Baluyevsky was fired. He was fired for political purposes, and 1 month before the war, his deputy, the commander of the main operations directorate, basically the guy who's going to run the war, was also fired. So what happened after that is, first of all, Nikolai Makarov, the new Chief of General Staff, he calls up Rukshin, former head of the main operations directorate, to say, you need to come back. We need you in this war. And he said, nah. You fired me, I'm not coming back. Later, after got a hold of Serdyukov calls up Rukshin and say, Rukshin, you need to get back. We need you. And he's like, nah, you fired me. And then a little bit later, Putin gets back. And Putin calls up Rukshin and says, you need to get back. And he's like, okay, I'm getting back. I'm going to handle this war. Main operations directorate was in the middle of a move, etc. For the Georgian case, I don't register a large political imprint from the general staff. But it's not that surprising because you just appointed a new chief of general staff. His mandate was probably quite soft, and he was appointed because of the problems with his predecessor, Yuri Balievsky. Fast forward, and I'm not going to delve into this in depth, but the Ukraine war, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, there's really a number of versions of how decision-making was taking place. I think there's kind of an agreement in the literature that I'm looking at that's basically saying it was 4 people. It was Putin, it was Nikolai Patrushev, it was Alexander Bortnikov, head of the FSB, and Sergei Ivanov, then head of the presidential administration. 3 former KGB directors and Putin himself. No general staff present. There's some version of this event saying Shoigu was present, but there's nothing supporting any kind of opposition to the political plan. And interestingly, this is not evidence, but it's just one interesting way to look at it. If you look at the way the EU and the US sanctioned Russian actors after the war, you see that the head of the GRU, the military intelligence, the FSB, was sanctioned for events in Crimea, whereas the general staff was only sanctioned for a military buildup on the border at the same time. Long story short is I don't see any kind of strong political role for the general staff in the 2014 invasion and coming to the Ukraine 2022 invasion. And I'm not going to belabor this point again. I think there are a number of different explanations to how was decision-making taking place in this war. And the most likely ones that Owen Matthews, Mikhail Zysk, and among others, is saying that in the room you had Nikolai Patrushev, head of the Security Council, Alexander Bortnikov, Sergei Shoigu, but Shoigu was hesitant, maybe. There's 2 different versions. One would say he didn't say anything, the other one was that he was hesitant. But there's nothing that indicates to me that the general staff played an important political role here. And this is interesting because, connecting to Michael's presentation, there was a number of factors that were not in place for the Russian armed forces to fight this war the way they wanted to fight this. It was all dependent on a coup d'etat that was going to cripple Ukrainian political military command to the point that it was not going to be a large scale, the largest war in Europe in the Second World War. Probably running over time, so I'll kind of go to my conclusion. And I think that this is really looping back full circle to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You have a plan very much driven by the KGB, the FSB. You have very, very favorable assumption on what was going to happen. You don't assume the large-scale use of military violence. And you have a general staff that is, in the Afghan case, actually outspoken but completely sidelined, whereas in Ukraine 2022, nothing that can be seen from the outside recommending against the war. By all likelihood, senior Russian military leadership needs to know their force posture and how unprepared they would have been for large-scale military war. There's 2 ways to explain it. Either they didn't realize in how bad shape they were, or they realized but they didn't want to speak truth to power. And what I'm also outlining in the paper is really the long-term kind of gradual retaking control of the military in Putin's Russia, in particular since the 2008. I would probably date it there when you stop seeing any kind of critical public statements from senior officers. Anyways, I'm running over time, but I would summarize my main argument really in one way, and that is general staff has been an actor influencing policy, but that has gradually decreased to a level where they are completely subservient to the political level and probably afraid or unable or unwilling to speak their best military advice to the political leadership. Thank you.
Okay, Katarzyna. Yeah.
Good afternoon. So my topic is slightly different. In this project, I covered the technological dimension of the Russian combat management, or C2, in the context of the Russian pursuit of emerging and disruptive technologies, EDTs in general, and artificial intelligence in particular. I know that it may seem to some of you counterintuitive to talk about high tech in case of Russia, given the image of the Russian army, widespread image of its failures and the Russian army in disarray. However, as you certainly know, the picture is quite complex. And the fact is that despite Russia being bogged down in Ukraine, the attention of the top political and military leadership, and Putin also personally, on pushing forward the AI development has actually continued, not only despite of the weakening of the Russian forces as a result of the failures in Ukraine, but actually also because of that. So, and there are several reasons for that. One major reason is that the Russian leadership, including Putin, see AI as having the potential to narrow the capability gap with the West, potentially in a nonlinear and rapid manner, by upgrading first the legacy, broad spectrum of legacy systems with AI, while alongside pursuing certain selected, how they call it, risky projects, so more experimental weapon systems, infrastructure, materials, and methods of warfare. And at the same time, the Russian push for AI is also driven by a concern that this development, that this technology in hands of the enemies will create new vulnerabilities and new threats to Russia's security, and it has to be addressed. So the diffusion of autonomous weapons system and AI-enabled systems and infrastructure is seen as also having the impact on that, something that will have an impact on some of the foundations of international security, such as deterrence and strategic stability. And ultimately, it also will decide how the power international system will be distributed and what kind of share of that Russia will get. So therefore, joining this technological race is not seen as a choice, but as a necessity, existential necessity, if we would believe Putin, who systematically presented it as something that is, either you ride the wave or you will be crushed by it. Putin has actually compared to this development to the invention of nuclear bomb, which kind of shows, this is something of historical proportions. And there is a number of priorities that Russia has on the list, and they include unmanned vehicles, high-precision weapons, nuclear weapons, air defense, electronic warfare, offensive cyber, information operations, logistics and manufacture. But the combat management is actually very highly prioritized. It is on the very top of the list because it is seen as critical in contemporary warfare, because gaining and maintaining information superiority is the very foundation of that. So one of the top priorities is also to basically, it's all about increasing the speed of decision-making and accuracy of decision-making with use of various uses of AI at the decision-making at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. And they also highlight that this is particularly important when we are dealing with a high degree of uncertainty, where we have inconsistent data in real time, and under time pressure, for instance, under incoming attack. So the focus is on developing complex cybernetic devices to provide a better foundation for building a system where AI can facilitate and accelerate the collection, search, recognition, management, and analysis of an extensive data from various platforms across the domains, from air, ground, sea, space, and cyber. So in December 2022, Putin called the government for integrating AI technologies at all levels of decision-making in the armed forces, pointing actually to the experiences from Ukraine, saying that what they've learned thus far is that the most effective weapon systems are those that operate quickly and almost in an automatic mode. And there is a number actually of known Russian AI applications in the command and control. They are at different stages of development, experimentation, implementation. To give you just an example, one is the National Defense Management Center that was created in 2014, which provides the sort of main all-domain C2 structure. It has been applying AI to support the collection and management of large amounts of information from multiple sources to enhance the overview of a battlefield and level out deficiencies in decision-making. Another example is the Command and Control Information System, the so-called ESBU, which uses AI and big data to integrate C4ISR capabilities in order to provide the leadership possible courses of action based on the assessment of the situation on the ground. These are systems came to our attention around 2019. These are relatively new, but this is something that is being worked on, being experimented with right now. There are also the so-called automated control system, ACS, that aim to automate the process of collection, processing, and delivery of information to provide situational awareness and decision-making. There are also elements of AI that are applied in control, reconnaissance, and navigation systems of unmanned vehicles. Another big lesson something that has been that the experiences from Ukraine supported the importance of these assets for air, ground, and sea-based missions. One is the Kubla, the kamikaze drone, and the Lancet 3 loitering munitions that Russia has been using quite extensively in Ukraine. As you may know, the unmanned vehicles, they were designated in December 22 as special priority for the Russian government, seen as an important element of the C4ISR system. There are also some examples of these systems at the tactical level. But because we don't have that much time, I will share with you some tentative conclusions that we can draw from this development. I think first, and of course I just gave you a few examples, but one of my conclusions is that Russia has developed an extensive ecosystem for EDTs, emerging and disruptive technologies, where AI is this kind of crown jewel or the foundation for most of the military EDT programs. But they still appear, or the Russian AI applications appear to be in the early stages of maturity. And there is a high degree of uncertainty about Russia's ability to broadly adopt AI across the military organization. And this is due to a number of reasons. One is the structural and the systemic problems, long-standing problems in the Russian military organization, but also in the broader political and economic system, including problems with excessive or widespread corruption, bureaucracy, repressive bureaucracy, red tape, problems with preferential state funding, problems with, of course, with the rule of law, which also undermine the investment climate, competitive research environment, which hamper creativity and innovation. So as the situations looks today, Russia is unlikely to become one of the global AI leaders next to the US and China. These problems are also further aggravated by the circumstantial obstacles that have been created by, for instance, economic stagnation. There are periods of recession, the pandemic, of course, but also sanctions, brain drain, and of course restricted access to foreign technology, among other implications of the war. On the other hand, however, there are some strengths of the Russian approach to innovation, which is very state-driven, top-down, and one of them is that there is a strong push from the top of the political structure, not least from Putin, to move the AI development ahead. And I think as we discussed today, I think it has been actually quite important in breaking the organizational rigidity, opening the military organization to new ideas, to outside influence. And that outside influence is quite important because the state sort of traditional defense innovation model has been opened up to extensive cooperation with the civilian sector in Russia. So one number I have come across is that 1,200 various entities from the Russian academia, research, and industrial sector, so the civilian sector cooperating closely with the military organization, so it can get access to ideas, to resources this way. To take the full advantage of AI, Russia will have to continue a number of things. One is, of course, continue skillfully circumventing sanctions, export regimes control, maintain China's support, obviously, but also continue minimizing the dependence on Western technologies, such as the software and semiconductors from the US, from Taiwan, and South Korea. Russia will also have to be able to integrate these new technologies. So one thing is, you invent the technology, but then you have to actually make it work across the military organization, change doctrines, change operational concepts. And as in my early project, which I published last year, I was quite skeptical about it. I didn't see many signs, but actually there are some indications that Russia may be moving in that direction. At the conceptual level, there are some concepts for the use of AI in the Russian armed forces, but also the adaptations we are seeing that Russia is using in Ukraine, which is, unfortunately, the battlefield in Ukraine is used as a laboratory to some of these technologies. So I think what is certain is that, well, a number of things, but one is that Russia will continue to have incentives to push this development forward, to pursue AI, given how they are resonating about it. And one reason is that AI-enabled systems are highly likely to proliferate across foreign militaries. I hope I didn't abuse the time. Thanks.
Thank you. Dima.
Can you hear me? Yes, wonderful. Okay. So good afternoon. It's very good to be here. Oscar, thank you very much for your hospitality. And thanks to all members of the team, those present and absent, for being such terrific colleagues. I think we're living, as Katarzyna said, in very tragic and unusual times. On the other hand, we are here trying to diagnose one of the most important questions of Russian strategic and operational behavior now and also for the observable future. So I think it's very important that we are investing intellectual energy into it. My main interest of research is to explore the capacity of the Russian military to practice what we call in the West mission command, or decentralized combat management style, when commanders share with their subordinates the intent of the mission and delegate to them the choice of ways and means in executing it. To put it very simply, as opposed to my colleagues that you have heard until now, and pretty much in line with what my colleague Dara Masigor is going to explore, we are focusing on the soft aspects or cultural aspects of command and control. Now, conventional wisdom suggests that historically and in this war, a Russian military or Russian combat management style is hyper-centralized and incompatible with what we call in the West mission command. My argument is that this claim is mischaracterization, and what I'm trying to do is to offer alternative interpretation based on two corpora of works. First of all, I'm looking at what Russian sociology, anthropology, and literature on organizational management in military and non-military affairs is or are writing about themselves in public administration, in private sector, in business and military affairs. And also it is based on interviews with Russian managers, Soviet managers, and Russian and Soviet commanders, and of course on the evidence from this war. My main argument is that historically and in this war, measuring Russian combat management style by Western yardstick and outside the context of the Russian strategic culture runs a risk of misperception. And I'm offering, I'm actually arguing that historically and in this war, Russian military is capable of practicing mission command a la Rus to a much greater extent that we are usually observing it in the West. So let me unpack my argument in 5 steps, or 5 sub-arguments. First of all, conventional wisdom misses very important nuances of how people in Russia for the last 100 years were dealing with this question. So if we look back to what is happening or has been happening in the Russian military for the last 100 years, we will see that this military has been searching for an optimal mix between centralization and decentralization, often various different terms. It's a question of единоначалие, the unity of command, versus коллегиальность, collegiality, or centralizированное as opposed to decentralizированное управление. Now, historically, capacity to delegate authority and act upon authority has existed, but it has varied across levels of command, peacetime and wartime, and also services within the Russian military. By Russian military, by the way, I mean Tsarist, Soviet, and also post-Soviet military. The aptitude for mission command a la Rus has been more prominent on their operational level, at times on strategic level, and to a lesser extent on the tactical level, or what we call in the West the level of their junior leadership. Tactical commanders had in Russia freedom of execution, but to a lesser extent than on the operational and strategic level, but at the same time more than some would assume. And there has been a constant effort, especially during the 10 years leading to this war, to refine this capacity. Argument number 2, Russian approach to mission command is unique, and it is unlike Western model of mission command. Russian approach rests on 3 conditions that may appear puzzling, counterintuitive, or even contradictory for people in this audience or to Western managerial cultures broadly defined. Let me take you very briefly through these 3 very counterintuitive characteristics and conditions of mission command a la Rus. First of all, the basic condition for mission command a la Rus is almost a metaphysical connection to the highest order combat mission, to the war's supreme goal. I'm talking about the connection of every commander or soldier to this overall raison d'etre of fighting. This connection generates, according to Russian military literature, moral psychological stability of the serviceman, and the later, in its turn, releases creativity, independence of thought, and initiative. Now, the second characteristic, initiative to take authority and also to delegate authority exist in Russian approach, but their meaning are very different from the West. Russian commanders often delegate authority unsupported by material capabilities. They expect their subordinates to accomplish the mission at any price. So initiative in Russia stands for subordinates' capacity to come up with creative solution for an impossible task and to fulfill the mission or the order against all odds. This by itself produces the main managerial theory of victory in Russia, which is effectiveness without efficiency, результативность без эффективности. And finally, mission command a la Rus, and probably this is the most counterintuitive one, it assumes or sees fear of punishment as enabler of initiative. In the Russian reading, one will be creative and entrepreneurial if one is more fearful of repression than of the battlefield challenges. So coercive atmosphere as a stimulator of creativity is oxymoron in the Western managerial tradition, but it's actually a norm in the Russian one. Argument number 3, let's have a very brief look into what has been happening in the Russian military in the 10 years leading to this war. Basically, you are looking at pre-war reforms. So prior to the war, Russian military was seeking to cultivate an aptitude for mission command. We saw it in exercises, we saw it in programmatic statements of the leadership, we saw it in their theoretical writings, and we also saw it in their fighting in Syria, which they also considered as a laboratory to test and then eventually to scale certain skills and proficiencies. Now, this endeavor extended earlier efforts to merge centralized and decentralized command control at their network-centric warfare era. So cultural challenges and organizational ills or traditional Russian deficiencies have hindered this endeavor. So when the war, when the invasion to Ukraine started, the Russian military was at the advanced steps of deep transformation and scaling it from selected units to the whole military. Argument number 4, mission command a la Rus in this war. This war, at least to me, indicated the Russian capacity to practice mission command not by design, but by default. In other words, despite the failure of the Supreme Command, at least at the initial stage or phase of this war, to realize the basic condition for it and to accomplish the pre-war reforms. So let me give you just several illustrations. First of all, on many occasions, especially in the early stages of this war, only decentralization and local initiative enabled operational tactical commanders to manage dispersed, outnumbered, and under-equipped units at the backdrop of constantly changing war aims and overall command control bardak, at least in the first months of this war. Number 2, cases of orders disobedience that were often reported in the West often indicated not the lack of discipline or demoralization, but initiative aimed to accomplish the combat mission and opposition to detrimental, irrelevant, dated, or simply stupid orders. I mean, stupid orders by the judgment of these people. And finally, the absence of adequate C4ISR capabilities. There has been widespread self-equipment leading to self-synchronization and self-coordination and functioning along the lines of mission command. Thanks to what they call often Narodny VPK, or military-industrial complex of Russian people. So wartime adaptations on all levels of command that many of my colleagues during the last year have writing about, they basically owe to this mission command a la Rus. And finally, the aptitude for mission command varied across the commanders. It depended on personality, and it also depends on the types of the forces. So they are more prominent in VDV, in naval infantry, in people's militias, in Kadyrov's units, and also in Wagner. My last point, it's about the adjustment of the metrics to measure what we are getting about Russian military. Western sources tend to measure Russian combat performance by the yardstick of mission command, which Western militaries reportedly practice. Let alone mirror imaging, there is a problem of self-delusion. Evidence from US military and from the IDF, I'm coming from Israel, both considered to be a paragons of mission command, suggest that there is a gap between the ideal image and reality. So mission command in both countries is an aspirational concept. I'm referring to the United States military and also to the IDF. Declaratively, there is an ethos. I mean, it's an ethos that is intact. But in reality, in both militaries, there is a micromanagement tendency of the higher level commanders enabled by C4ISR to interfere in combat management. In other words, the so-called 9,000 miles screwdriver. Both militaries recognize that they have a challenge of trusting subordinates to execute seniors' intent and relative atrophy of junior commanders' ability to challenge authority. For that reason, the former chairman of the US military, General Milley, published a famous article about the necessity to cultivate disciplined disobedience and capacity to smartly disobey orders among US junior commanders. And finally, the point about NCO that my friend and colleague Michael Kofman has been writing quite a lot, it's neither a necessary condition for mission command nor its lower threshold. In the US, the gap between the mission command ethos and the capacity to implement it applies to non-commissioned officers as well. And in the IDF today, as in the Russian military, by the way, as a rule, the lowest threshold for mission command would be an officer rather than NCO. And just to make it even stronger, NCOs do exist in Russia, and by the way, much more than the West often envisions. So just to conclude, first, the future of the Russian command management style is not predetermined. Russian performance and underperformance in this war highlighted the relevance of the early efforts, Russian early efforts, to call for a refinery of centralization-decentralization mix. This intent remains intact as we speak. So professional writings and social media discussions in Russia are indicating it very well. Point number two, the evolution of the command control style depends on the lessons that the Russian military is learning, especially the opinions of the emerging military aristocracy. A new generation of commanders that this war is now shaping will be central to this process. To cultivate a novel command style takes longer and more challenging than producing a new doctrine, a new organization, or a new weapon. It was and will be challenging for the Russian military given its traditional managerial and ills and national mentality. At the same time, conditions that have been absent during peacetime may be materializing more fully during the wartime. And debacles in war may catalyze cultural challenges that are cultural changes and cultural solutions that are impossible in peacetime. Russian adaptations of command and control procedures and architecture have already begun. This doesn't ensure success, but it's definitely is indicative of the intent of the Russian military. And the more protracted this war and this conflict is, the more learning cycles will occur and the higher are the chances for their change. So whether this transformation will be confined only to wartime, only to their theater of operations, or to the specific units, or it will penetrate more deeply and lastingly into the DNA of the Russian military remains unclear, but even minor changes in this realm might have rather broad and wide implications. Thank you, I'll stop here.
Okay, well, thank you to our four excellent speakers. We had one speaker who did not demonstrate disciplined disobedience with the time allotted. So that's left us with about 23 minutes for the event here.
DoD training.
So, which is actually opposite of the norm.
Yeah.
So maybe it's best to kind of bin a couple questions at once. And I recognize I'm not going to use any prerogative here. So I'm going to go to the audience. What questions do we have? And I'll collect a couple. So the first, the second. Okay, first. Okay, we've got a speaker here that's coming to you.
Okay. Hello.
A microphone.
Thank you. I'll go back to the first presentation when you spoke about the role of the General Staff. You mentioned the war with Afghanistan, the war in Chechnya, etc., but you left out the war with Georgia. Why?
Okay, well, let's hold that for a second and then just collect it.
The question, how can we explain all these experiments with command of the military operation against Ukraine? We started these 30 days, as Mike mentioned. 4 military district commanders were in charge of their own forces and moved. And we can theoretically suppose that General Staff tried to coordinate their efforts. In May, we were informed that Lapin became commander-in-chief of all operations. In October, we were said that Surovikin is in charge. And in February, again, Gerasimov was appointed in charge of this operation. Only in March 2023, we know that Putin visited joint staff deployed somewhere in Rostov. So how can we explain all this mess? Do we understand who is now in charge of this operation? Because, as all of us understand, Chief of General Staff for sure cannot control everything in concrete military operation. He has a lot of duties accepted. So who is in charge of this operation?
Okay, maybe we'll start there with Oscar, and then you can answer both questions, and then I think Mike will pick up from you.
Well, the very direct answer is I did address Georgia, even briefly. That was the story of when Putin and Patrushev was in Beijing and Rukshin and Balujevsky was fired. So, yeah.
Take up the second question.
I mean, yes, who is in charge or how do we explain the experiment? I think, as Mike started alluding to with the different grouping of forces fighting their own war, why didn't we have a unified commander from the beginning? It's a difficult question. There's one theory which it's hard to substantiate, but I think it's very interesting. It's also the political desire to avoid the Zhukov type figure, that because of the planning and assumption was that this will go well, and you wanted a quick victory. You didn't want to have a military figure getting all the creds for all the success to it. So that's one of the reasons for fragmentization of command. It's really hard to verify it, but it's a thought that I cannot just dismiss neither. Who's running it today? I mean, I'm happy to hear more from Mike, but I would assume most of it's coming from Rostov and the headquarters there. Of course, formerly Gerasimov, under him the main operations directorate, and I don't know if it's a unified JAC now, but I'm sure Mike might be able to help.
Sure. So very briefly, so the assumption before the war, right, was that when Russian forces generated as doctrinally planned, trained, and whatnot for this type of large-scale operation, that Western Southern Military District would split Ukraine in terms of theater military operations, and Western and Southern Military District would field all the other people's forces, right? That's the way it would have made most sense. It would have had unity of effort, division of theater, and whatnot. That's obviously not what happened. As you said, five groupings of forces deployed, 4 regional, and the VDV airborne actually was the 5th combat grouping on its own to be flanked and protected by the Eastern Military District in their assault on Kiev. Logistics. If you look at Southern Military District's offensive coming out of Crimea, it splits in 4 different directions, complete 4 different directions, like this on the map. So it's just competing with itself already right off the bat for resources. And because these forces are arrayed in brittle battalion tactical groups, which are optimized for local war armed conflict for a duration of no more than a few weeks, right? And they're fairly brittle in terms of peacetime formations. They neither have the innate sustainability, nor do they have the manpower, nor do they have the force structure to sustain a prolonged conventional war, right? And I won't get into like the hundreds of other points I can make that Rosguardia is in the lead of some of the formations. If you look at the order of battle, actually, and it's independently going in to stabilize cities, there's all sorts of craziness happening that can only be explained by the fact that the concept of the Russian operation is that this is like a larger version of the siege or annexation Crimea of 2014, and that Ukrainian forces will largely stand down. And the concept for the coup de main seems to be heavily borrowed from Operation Danube, the takeover of Czechoslovakia, right? Except this is like, for lack of a better analogy, like a cheap Rolex watch knockoff attempt to copy that effort, you know, like basically to do it without any of the resources or without sufficient planning. All right. So once the Russian military then after March 25 redeploys and begins the campaign for the Donbass, the regional grouping of forces persists, and they essentially become frontal commands. As you know, before this, Russia eliminated frontal command as a structure from the military, and each of them was responsible for something like 150 to 250 kilometers worth of frontage. And the groupings of forces commanders are 3-star commanders, right? These are colonel generals. And the way the war is run is, yes, there's a director of operations, Rudskoy, the general staff, if you notice, has been there from the beginning. And early on in the war, he was the one making the announcements, if you go back to March. He's the one that's speaking, right? And we've had a couple kind of like general commanders, but the war seems to be run by the commanders of the regional groupings of forces and the forces allocated to them. And Gerasimov actually has been involved throughout. While there's been different reporting the extent to which he's been estranged, he has never been estranged far enough, which actually to me explains some of the poor performance throughout. His role in particular is notable. So today, who is singularly in charge post-Surovikin, officially it's Gerasimov, right? In practice, you're very right. No, Gerasimov by himself can't be there moving the piece enough. But he is, I think, heavily involved in the offensive operations, like Kharkiv and others. I think he's more involved than people imagine it to be. What else can I tell you about the current organization? So the reality is that this was neither the way Russian military is planned to fight large-scale regional war, but of course, the initial full-scale invasion was conducted on the assumption that it wouldn't be, and one of the, I think, best ways to explain it is that they assumed they would be rapidly shifting to a stabilization phase, and these different groupings of forces would be occupying Ukraine. This is why they didn't strike most critical infrastructure that people expected, like myself. This is why the initial air campaign to suppress Ukrainian air defense had a real modicum of strike and sorties in the early days. And this is why a lot of things didn't happen that people kind of assumed might happen in a war that would place the Ukrainian military as a center of gravity, rather than attempt to paralyze and shock the local military leadership and to achieve sort of a victory rapidly, but without having to engage in a prolonged fight. So I'm sorry, it's a much longer conversation, but I don't want to take up the rest of my colleagues' time.
Thank you, Mike. More questions from the audience? Yes, one here to start, and please others, because I'd like to bin a few at a time. Yeah,
Yes, I had a question regarding the news that came out a few weeks ago about Shoigu being fired, or I guess reassigned within the Russian military, and him being replaced with Andrei Belosov, former economist, as head of the Russian Defense Ministry, and sort of what expectations can come from this new appointment.
And another question here down in the middle, a couple rows down, you can pass it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Thomas. I'm dealing with moral and rhetoric things and legal things. How to understand a man like Putin or the Russian people? What are the intention between the start and the goal? You're just talking about the culture. What is the genuine Putin culture inside? I don't believe in fear, but it must be something more.
And our third question here, Johan.
Thank you. Dima, you've written somewhere that the Russians have fantastic notions and concepts, but are pathetically poor at implementing them. Number one. Number two, there's been a terrible attrition on officers in this war. Of all this that you're describing now, looking forward, how much can actually be implemented?
Okay,
what kind of change will it entail for the war and so on?
Dima, you want to see them in reverse order, whatever you like, and then we'll organize after. Third.
My chain of command starts with you. Just tell me
Okay,
what
so third question, second question, and if you want the first as well, and then we'll move through. Do you want to take one of the questions as well?
I'll take the one first on this one. Jon, thank you. You are absolutely right. But I'm historian of Russian military, and I'm also historian of Russian strategic culture, and I'm historian of ideas in Russia. So what history teaches me, and I guess us all, that this attrition rates at the first stages of the war, life doesn't stop there. Life continues. The most interesting aspect of this life is promotion path of junior officers in the front. What we know from the previous campaigns, when war is over, there are still people left in the Russian military, right? And these people are also products of this war. So their way of thinking, their way of behavior, their intellectual bravery, and their organizational bravery is usually higher than during the pre-war time. By the way, this is exactly the time also, the wartime, when the political leadership is much more relaxed in delegating authority than in the peacetime. When the war is over, then usually political leadership is trying to take this authority from the military. We saw it in the Soviet times, we saw it in the Tsar times. It's a recurring pattern. Now, as long as we are in the wartime, these people, this new emerging military aristocracy, they have a say. And since there is a pre-war corpus of knowledge and there is a pre-war organizational climate, the combination of existing conceptual intent plus pre-war experience and organizational climate plus this new cadre of people can produce things that are unexpected and counterintuitive in peacetime. So I wouldn't read into it more than it exists there, but I wouldn't also underestimate this capacity. On the question of legality and ethics, just a quick one. I don't have enough time to unpack it, but one of the works in progress in which I'm focused right now is just war theory in Russia and also military ethics that is emerging in Russia and the whole corpus of knowledge that is produced on this matter in Russia. It may sound super counterintuitive, even more counterintuitive that AI technology that Katarzyna was talking about, but it's a medical fact. So for whatever reason, and I will hopefully offer to you explanations of it in a couple of months from now, but it's a medical fact that there is an organizational and intellectual energy invested within the defense establishment and outside the defense establishment into the matter of military ethics and just war theory. And the last one on nominations, it's a great question. I'm sure my colleagues can elaborate more than myself, but I would just add another two interesting questions, or one question, one observation that you might have. One, it's what's happening with Patrushev, who is moved from his position, and he is moved right now to be responsible for a naval component, for судостроение. And we can have very interesting explanations why, okay, because it is also one of the fields where the Russian military has been underperforming. So we can talk more. And on Belousov, he's the son of his father, as all of us, who are sons and not daughters, right? So even daughters are daughters of their fathers. So it's, but we have different fathers. Belousov's father was one of the leading figures working for Kosygin. And Kosygin, during the Soviet era, was one of their key figures in Russia, in Soviet industry, and industry that was more in defense industry. And Belousov's father was actually one of the defense intellectuals and practitioners that was helping the Soviet system to sustain itself in their civilian industry and also in the defense industrial sector. I think this is also, I mean, that's not the reason for his nomination, but I think his family story and also the role that he is occupying and has been occupying in the Russian system is indicative of the expectation that the political leadership has right now from this particular Ministry of Defense and from this position in general. Over to you.
I will speak to the Putin's objectives. And I think what is interesting, we could talk the whole night about it, but I will speak to the strategic objectives. And what is interesting, I think that a number of these objectives have been actually quite stable since the end of 1990s, the beginning 2000s, and quite clearly communicated by the Russian leadership. And they include, of course, such obvious things like maintaining territorial integrity, but also since Primakov, the foreign minister, 1999, the objective of creating multipolar world order, which means also undermining the dominance of the United States international system, which is also connected to the objective of changing, reshaping the European security architecture, which is one of these objectives, and reestablishing Russia's rightful place in the international system, and of course, in particular in Europe, which means having rights in saying what is happening, of course, in the so-called near abroad, but also in other key questions of European and international security. And these, what is interesting, these are actually long-standing objectives. So, for instance, Lavrov was talking in 2007 about building sort of he was talking about a concert of great powers for the 21st century, basically a great powers club, quite small. In 2007, he talked about the US, Russia, and the EU. Later on, EU was exchanged with China. Pretty ambitious, right? And if you may remember, in 2008, Medvedev, former president, he actually proposed a draft of a new European security. So Russia tried to achieve these objectives with political means. These were ignored at the time. And as Russia has reformed and strengthened the military, with the reforms in 2008, Russia has increasingly also used military means and a spectrum of non-military means, such as interference in political processes, export of corruption, to achieve these objectives. Interestingly, I think that Putin in 2014 in the Valaday Forum, he said that either there will be new rules, or Russia will follow no rules. And I think, in a sense, Ukraine, of course, in many respects, Putin is and has been opportunistic, when things happen. But in my view, there are actually quite consistent aspects of Putin's Russia behavior on the international stage, which the war in Ukraine is an expression of. Yeah, I think I will stop here.
Yeah, just very briefly to hit on Johan's question. Even though you asked it to Dima, Johan, I'm going to take a bite briefly to say that, look, a lot of Western thinking, I think, is very much oriented around peacetime forces, peacetime concepts, and the initial period of war, right? And part of what you asked, I think, really should lead us to think harder about prolonged conventional war. And we know wars between major powers often go on much longer than political leaders expect or plan. They become wars focused on the management of attrition, reconstitution, defense, industrial mobilization. So what happens when the high-quality initial force is lost, which is what happened to Russia? It also happened over time to Ukraine, and these are not the same armies that started the war. You know, in this, 2+ years into the war, you're now seeing two different forces, although you're watching the same war, right? And in some areas, the Russian military had degraded, for example, in its ability to employ force at scale. In other areas, it improved and mounted a fairly competent defense and a prepared defense last year during Ukraine's summer offensive. It's improved significantly in dynamic targeting and implementing of concepts that they couldn't execute early on in the war, and it's very visible in the last 8 months. It was able to adopt technologies from electronic warfare, which Russia was very strong in originally, but actually began to employ differently with different systems. Much the same can be said on various counters and adaptations that were made to Western technologies that were introduced in the war, for example, long-range precision strike systems of various types. And lastly, employments of all sorts of types and drones. Ukraine was the leader and innovator across the battlefield in bottom-up innovation and employment of these systems, but the Russian military copied, adapted fairly quickly, and began to scale those solutions. So we have to talk about the pluses and the minuses, right? And so the degradation of the force is visible. The loss of force quality from a competent officer and staffing level is visible too, and it's very hard to recover on the one hand. On the other hand, if we follow any prolonged conventional war, the war does go on, forces find a way to go on. And to be frank, a lot of troops on the battlefield, if you survive the first month or so there, they begin to learn what they need to do, what they need to learn to survive for much of the fight. The typical break in Ukraine is, about 3 to 4 months. If you've lasted on the front that long, there's a good chance you've learned the skills now to be able to fight. You're not going to be great at, staff work, mission analysis, and these other things that, you learn at an organization like this, maybe like Swedish Defense University. But nonetheless, the war is going to go on, and they do. So it's important to kind of balance the story about degradation, adaptation, and the changes that happen to a force.
Okay, and with 2 minutes remaining, Oscar, for some closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. Great. Well, I inescapably go back to early 2000s, vivid debate in Russian military theory about the direction of future war. On the one hand, we have Lieutenant General Vladimir Slipchenko, and on the other hand, Mahmoud Karayev, former Deputy Chief of General Staff. And Slipchenko's thoughts were all the rage. He was basically saying, hey, new wars will be super high-tech, long-precision missile strikes, C4ISR complexes. Let's absolve all the branches and just have strategic defense and strategic offense. And a lot of his theorizing caught wind, and it was incredibly popular. Garayev's theorizing didn't really catch on in the same way, but he said, hey, guys, look at history. The way we always win war is endurance and industrial mobilization, and that ties into the question of what is Belousov doing there. I think it's a recognition of what was not that popular in early 2000s, is that Russia wins war through industrial production and mobilization of all of society, and just hanging in there and fighting the adversary. So that's one thing I would read into it, but there's more stories about Belousov. But that will be the closing remarks. So while still speaking, I want to thank the panel so much for coming. Without that, it wouldn't be anything. I want to thank the audience for devoting this afternoon with us. So let's thank everybody with a warm round of applause.